Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Margaret Knowles, and I am a second-year executive MBA candidate at Columbia Business School, where I am the chair of the Student Leadership and Ethics Board. A few notes about this evening's discussion. This discussion will center on the rise of economic inequality in the United States and globally, with a focus on highlighting its causes and exploring potential solutions. And it will feature experts from academia, policy, and private industry. The event is hosted by SLEB and the Stanford C. Bernstein Co. Center for Leadership and Ethics. The Bernstein Center serves as a forum for thought leadership around teaching and research on ethics and governance challenges confronting current and next generation business leaders. The Bernstein faculty leaders and the Student Leadership and Ethics Board shape the curriculum, organize speaker events, experiential learning activities, and other sessions in topics surrounding leadership, ethics, and governance. The Student Leadership and Ethics Board is truly the student voice on ethical leadership and activities at Columbia Business School. Our purpose is to foster a culture and safeguard a tradition of principled leadership throughout the Columbia Business School community. The board fulfills its purpose by developing, implementing, and monitoring programs that cultivate leadership, build character, and promote ethical decision-making, which in turn enable Columbia Business School students to become productive, moral, and caring participants in their companies and communities. I will also note for the students out there that this discussion is part of PPIL, the Phillips Pathway for Inclusive Leadership, a co-curricular program aimed at equipping students with the essential skills and strategies necessary to lead in an inclusive and ethical manner across industries. Today's program will help you hone the essential inclusive leadership skill of addressing systemic inequity. Please note that for PPIL credit, all full-time MBA students can utilize the self-check-in kiosk that Shirley just dropped the link in the chat. And remember to submit your post-event reflection form available on your PPIL checklist on campus groups. I'm now going to hand it over to tonight's moderator, SLEB board member, Tom Goldenberg.
Thank you so much, Margaret, for that introduction. So I'm very happy to be here, very honored to introduce our guests. We'll be talking about the state of economic inequality in the United States, but also globally, and what are potential solutions for addressing it. So first, I'd like to introduce Joseph Stiglitz, is a Nobel laureate, former chief economist of the World Bank, former chairman of President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors, a pioneer of pivotal concepts such as adverse selection and moral hazard, which have now become standard tools of policy analysts and economic theorists. And of course, a professor here at Columbia University. Thank you, Professor Stiglitz, for joining us. Next, we have Mayor Michael Nutter is the David Dinkins Professor of Professional Practice at Urban and Public Affairs at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. He served as the 98th mayor of his hometown, Philadelphia, from 2008 until 2016, during which time he managed the city's recovery during the financial crisis, including having a hand in more than $11.5 billion of economic development projects. Since leaving office, Professor Nutter has been engaged in a number of activities, including serving on the Advisory Council for the Department of Homeland Security, being a political commentator for CNN, and a senior fellow for Bloomberg Philanthropies. Thank you so much, Professor Nutter, for joining us.
My pleasure. Thanks.
And last but not least, Anu Madgavkar is a partner at McKinsey Global Institute, McKinsey & Company's business and economics research arm. Ms. Madgavkar leads global research focused on labor markets and human capital, technologies, economic impact, gender economics, digital and financial inclusion, and inclusive growth. She's led research efforts focused on India's economic growth, labor market, and digital economy. And she has co-authored MGI reports such as The Future of Work After COVID-19, The Future of Women at Work, The Power of Purity, How Advancing Women's Equality Can Add $12 trillion to Global Growth, and many others. Thank you so much, Anu, for joining us here as well.
Thank you for having me.
A little bit about myself. I am a executive MBA student at Columbia Business School. I'm also an engagement manager at McKinsey & Company. and I'm very excited to be able to moderate this discussion on economic inequality. So just a little bit about the format for those of everyone who are listening in, and also thank you everyone who's tuned in to listen to this discussion. I'll be leading some pre-written questions or just having a discussion and dialogue with the panelists for the first part of the conversation. And then with about 20-25 minutes left, we'll open it up for question and answer. So feel free to submit any questions you might have during the discussion, and just know that we'll be going through the questions and submitting them to the panelists after the initial discussion. So let me open it up. It's a very big topic that we're talking about, and all three of you have such an amazing background and an amazing experience dealing with some of these issues. So the first thing I'd like to introduce is, when we talk about economic inequality, what we do know is that it has increased in advanced economies, and especially in the United States. If you look at the Gini coefficient, is a measure that's used to measure income inequality, and it's grown over the last 50 years. We're seeing it, similar to what it was before the Great Depression. But what there is debate about is, why is that a problem? And so I just kind of wanted to address kind of like, why is inequality a problem? I know all three of you have written about this topic, but there are a number of voices, both in economics and in politics, that would argue that it's not a problem. So, for example, in economics, we have the going back, to earlier decades, we had, I believe it was Simon Kuznets, who believed that inequality was part of the development that led to more prosperity. We have, politicians like Mitt Romney, when he ran for president, who said that talking about inequality was a politics of envy. And we have also, economists today. There's a book that the Cato Institute published called Anti-Piketty, where they very much argue that inequality is not so much of a big deal that people have made it up to be. So I'd love to hear from each of your perspectives. Why is inequality a problem? What is the current state of inequality, and what are the potential harms that it introduces? So maybe Professor Stiglitz, would like to start with you, and then maybe we can go around the room and hear people's views.
Well, I think Kuznets was writing about the natural processes of development, where at the early stages of development, there would be an increase in inequality as some were able to take advantage of new opportunities, and then others would catch up. But he was writing in the 1950s, and he had no way of anticipating what was going to happen in the next 60 years. I think, sometimes Kuznets wrote it was called Kuznets' Law. The laws in economics are not like laws in physics. They get repealed all the time. And this was one of those laws that I think you would be shocked at what happened beginning in the mid-70s, late 70s and 80s, with the growth of inequality. So it didn't correct itself. Now, I wrote a book a few years ago called The Price of Inequality, and I argued that our society, our economy, our politics pays a very high price for the high level of inequality that we have. Much of that inequality is associated with exploitation, rent seeking. An aspect of the inequality is lack of opportunities for those at the bottom. So overall, there's a broad consensus that is developed in economics that economies with more inequality perform more poorly. So in the 1960s, Arthur Okun, who was chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors under President Johnson, wrote a book called The Big Trade-Off, saying, oh, the only way you can get reduce inequality was by reducing growth. That view is now widely rejected even by conservative, traditionally conservative institutions like the IMF. And they've said, if you want to increase growth, you really have to deal with the problems of inequality. And I would say part of that, this is a huge topic, but it's how inequality divides our society and the pernicious effect it has on our politics, which I'm sure Professor Nutter will talk about shortly. But I think the problems that we are seeing in American politics, which have such a terrible effect on our health, on our stability, our global reputation. Inequality is at least a significant part of what we are experiencing. It's not the only thing that's going on, and I think economists sometimes exaggerate the importance of inequality. And then finally, let me say, as we're all going through COVID-19, we've seen how this plays out, inequality plays out in the pandemic. It has exposed, exaggerated our inequalities and the many dimensions of inequality, one aspect of which is inequalities in health. And because America has a overall poorly performing healthcare system, where life expectancy was on decline before the pandemic, and we had larger numbers of people who were more vulnerable, and we had larger health inequalities than other countries of comparable standards of living, of GDP. So it plays into, part of the reason we've had more deaths than any other country is our inequality.
Thank you, Professor Stiglitz. Professor Nutter, would you like to kind of elaborate from the political lens as well as what you've seen in urban areas and across the country?
Well, Tom, I'm gonna, because I know you have a bright political future, so I'm gonna save you from yourself and make sure that you don't have the two guys on the panel go first. And so I'm gonna suggest that our colleague Anu goes now, and I'll kind of come on in the third batter box.
Sounds good.
Sure, happy to jump in, Mayor Nutter, thank you for that. I'm going to take the opportunity to both completely agree with Professor Stiglitz in that there is a price to inequality which we absolutely cannot afford to ignore, particularly from an intergenerational standpoint, because what is today inequality in outcomes is tomorrow inequality of opportunity, and that becomes even more systemic and entrenched and sort of hard to tackle. And even as we say that, I think it's important to also broaden the aperture or the lens a little bit and to think about what's going on, as Professor Stiglitz said, which is connected with, correlated with, and associated with inequality. And these are equally, I think, important foundational values that people hold dear. And they would include things like basic sufficiency. So what is a minimum acceptable standard of living for a household? The answer varies very much as you look in different parts of the world, but every society has its equivalent. And when you have significant parts of the population not able to reach that, that's a real problem that sits pretty high up in any household sense of prioritization. There is the value of advancement, to feel that you are doing better and you can look forward to prospects that are better, and perhaps your children can as well. And so broad-based progress and improvement in outcomes is also extremely important. And stitching this together with the concept of inequality, the challenge is with mounting inequality, you really rise up against a wall on some of these other values as well. So they tend to be mutually reinforcing in a negative way. And you also might face limits to growth in a sense, as you think about the fact that inequality drives systematically a shortage of skills that we need for the knowledge economy. Inequality systematically constrains or weakens demand, which acts as an impediment to investment and so on. So all of these need to be looked at together. And as I think about the US advanced economies, but also the global economy, I think what's really interesting in the last 2 decades has been the fact that in many ways, levels of inequality or differences across countries for most of the last 2 decades have narrowed, particularly with the rise of some of the faster growing emerging economies, particularly led by Asia, which has pushed 1 billion people out of extreme poverty, right, over this period of 2 decades. But while that's the good news from a global inequality perspective, the challenges have been that across virtually all emerging economies, what we have seen is that inequality levels within these economies have either risen sharply, measured by things like the earnings ratio of the top 10% relative to income growth for the economy as a whole. So either risen sharply, or where it has been steady, those countries have had high inequality to start with. So that hasn't been good news. And then as you think about the advanced economies, which is the US and a set of European economies that we studied in some detail, we have observed a real weakening and erosion of the social contract in many ways, which is a manifestation of inequality that has meant that for the median or the average household, and for segments and quintiles of the population below that, you've seen wages flatlining, but also the cost of living in terms of the basics of healthcare, housing, education in many countries, actually eroding even whatever meager gains there have been. So institutions have systematically stepped back from this role of buffering households from shock. COVID has dealt a further body blow, and we'll come to that, I'm sure, as we address parts of how accelerating changes, even on the technology side, will only make skill transitions and employment transitions more challenging, and will particularly affect for the first time workers in certain types of jobs that were particularly hard hit by the pandemic: retail, accommodation, and food services. We're going to see higher levels of automation and job displacement, even in such kinds of work, bigger challenges in terms of bridging inequality here. So altogether, not something that we can ignore, and completely the point that there is a big price to pay for this.
Anu. All right, Mayor Nutter.
Yes. Thank you to both of my colleagues. Tom, I'm going to start with this because, again, we've been talking about inequality. Many folks on this call will be familiar with what I'm getting ready to say. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. They are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Of course, preamble Declaration of Independence, right? But we know, and I'm focusing in on the word equal, we know that that was not true that day. And it has not been true every day since. And so inequality has been built into at least this American system from the beginning, possibly from before the beginning, and has continued through a series of laws, statutes, court decisions, that, at that point in time, only certain people could own land, only certain people could have jobs, and others were casted aside or enslaved. And so we also have to talk about wealth. It's not just what you make at your job, it's also your wealth that really determines what your status is. And it is not a unique coincidence or just a coincidence that, Black people have about 1/10 of the wealth on average that white people do.
Mhm.
Inequality shows its head, and both of my colleagues have touched on this in different ways, but let's just stick with the last year or so, because of course, COVID-19 has revealed every deficiency of every system in this country, if not around the world, who, ultimately, some people, of course, were able to escape cities where there were many, many challenges, like New York, to go to that other house, somewhere else, or was bigger, or could actually have more of their family create their own pod, right? In the bigger house with the bigger space and the yard and everything else that goes with it, while people in cities were stuck when their folks came home, quote unquote, there were just more of them in a confined space, right? Working at jobs that put them in the front lines, while many of us, starting with myself, could work from home. And I have internet and a computer and enough bandwidth that I, my wife and daughter could all conduct our business here in our house, where some others actually don't even have internet in their home or a computer to connect to the internet. And so this issue of inequality, the only people who have any dispute about whether inequality matters are folks who are not affected by inequality, right? Poor people do not want to be poor. No one wants to be poor. No one wants to be poor, but there are poor people, certainly, in the United States. And it is not due to, well, if they just work a little harder, if they just put a little more effort in, if they would just go to school, and a variety of other, myths to some extent about folks who are not in a better economic, socioeconomic position. And so, excuse me, of course, inequality matters. And as I specifically remember Professor Stiglitz talking about, I mean, it's, look, here's an example on the ground. Are you telling me that the 24% of the population of my city, Philadelphia, who are living in poverty, the highest poverty rate of the 10 largest populated cities in the United States of America, nearly 400,000 people. Are you saying that it would not be better for the economy and the government of the city of Philadelphia if more and more of those folks were working, paying taxes, and being able to take care of themselves? I mean, you don't have to be, Joe Stiglitz, Warren Buffett, even Jimmy Buffett could figure out that that makes no sense whatsoever. Getting people off the sidelines and being able to use their God-given talents in ways that, with the dignity of work and the ability to take care of themselves and their families is just good overall. It's good public policy, it's good politics, and it's good for the economy. So, dealing with those kinds of issues and getting more people back in the game of economic opportunity and vitality just makes a whole lot of sense. And there are poor Democrats, there are poor Republicans, there are poor independents, there are folks who are not registered with any party. Getting all of them more engaged and involved in the American economy is just good for America and the world.
Thank you, Mayor Nutter, for really bringing that home. And I love that you bringing some very concrete examples, right? Because sometimes we, the discussion ends up being at the very theoretical level, but these are real lives, real livelihoods, real stories. And you're absolutely right. The policies, and I'd like us to go into kind of what policies we could think of, or what actions by different actors could be considered, but that's really what gets impacted is people on the ground. A lot of really rich discussion. Anu, I love your comment about the social contract and how that is kind of eroded over time, and the need to address both mobility, which I think Mayor Nutter, you're referring to, kind of everyone deserves a shot at economic mobility, and a fair chance in that regard, but they're also just meeting sufficient needs or basic needs. And without that, you lose out on the development of human capital. So I'd like to switch over into kind of, understanding that there is a lot of economic inequality, that people that are being left out of economic growth and prosperity are just missing out on opportunities for that economic mobility, for opportunities. What are some policies, and Professor Stiglitz, you mentioned that it doesn't have to be a trade-off, right? Between if we want to redistribute wealth or redistribute access, it doesn't necessarily mean that growth has to slow down. And so would like to open it up into what are some kind of pressing needs here in the United States or globally that that are kind of top of mind policies to address inequality in the US, globally. Would like to open up that discussion.
Well, let me first say there's no silver bullet. You have to do lots of things. You have to do everything, basically. And inequality in our society is so pervasive that you basically have to get into the weeds in almost everything we do. So, just in a taxonomic sense, one way of thinking about it is you need to improve the market distribution of income, and that's sometimes called pre-distribution, and then you have to redistribute. And sometimes there's been a focus on only the redistribution, but it's really the market distribution. Market distribution is affected by two things. Endowments, how much assets do people have, and the returns they can get. And that has to do with this agenda that was mentioned of opportunity, human capital, but it's more than, just education. It's, our whole system of connections, of how you get ahead is very much related to perpetuation of across generation of advantages and disadvantages. So the disadvantage, those with advantages work very hard to keep those advantages for their children. So I think you have to think about this very systemically. One of the things I think that's very important to realize that to the extent to which the inequalities that pervade our society have been a matter of choice, but not of the individuals involved. No one, as the mayor pointed out, no one wants to be poor. It's a matter of politics and the choices we confronted individuals with. So, for instance, one of the things that was very noteworthy about the rescue bill that was passed under Biden in the beginning of this year, in 1 year, it was projected by people here at Columbia that childhood poverty would be reduced by 50%. Now, if you could do that in 1 year as one piece of legislation, you can imagine, the lesson of that is we could have done that 40 years ago. We could have done, so let's be clear. It's because of our lack of action in dealing with inequality and the extreme of deprivation that we have such inequality. Another aspect that's very important on the other side is the pervasive exploitation of market power. One of the points that President Biden has raised is that we ought to be looking at the pervasive market power in our society, which results in economic distortions, lower growth, but also more inequality. There is a whole variety of exploitation. We have private for-profit schools that are specialized in nothing more than taking advantage of those who aspire to get ahead. And they've worked very hard and successfully to resist regulation that would circumscribe their exploitation. So, I could go on, but it's the weakening of unions, failures in our financial system, failures in our corporate governance. So my view is that the only way we're going to make significant dents in our inequality and succeed in getting a more dynamic economy with more shared prosperity is that if we take this very holistic approach and see every part of the structure of our society as the role that it plays in perpetuating the inequalities that we've had.
Thank you, Professor. Anu or Mayor Nutter, any comments?
Well, I'd like to jump in with a bit of an angle around what sort of the business sector can do about this, because there's a whole policy agenda and of course a range of choices that need to be made in that regard. But for businesses, quite often the starting points are pretty close to what even matters for their own holistic impact and delivery of value to stakeholders. So thinking about skills and equipping workers is pretty central both to the inequality problem as well as to securing growth and transitions through the future of work for companies and businesses in the private sector. And that clearly presents itself as a big space in which it's not the traditional approaches that will be sufficient going forward just because of the nature of the acceleration of the kinds of skills that are in demand in the future relative to what was in demand in the past. And just the fact that in the US alone, something like 17 million workers will need to practically reinvent what they do in order just to stay employed. We're not even talking about the partial reskilling that the rest of the workforce will need. So new kinds of approaches that really almost use this as an opportunity to forge a much stronger relationship between the employer and the employee. In some ways, the tightness of the labor market, the post-COVID trends that we're seeing in which it's harder to actually staff up as the economy opens up may, in a strange kind of way, almost act as an incentive, I hope, for businesses to say, hey, we need to find new ways to kind of strengthen this bond and forge this relationship with our employees, because it has weakened over this period, and workers are looking at options and really thinking about what matters to them and making choices. So being a partner in the process of building skills and taking those steps along your career journey could be a very powerful way for businesses to have a positive impact on inequality. The second thing I would say is that inequality of place, or the spatial dimensions of inequality, are huge, particularly in countries like the US with continental dimensions and a huge amount of disparity between urban and rural, and then even within urban, there's a huge disparity with an extremely high concentration of growth and jobs in just a few centers. So partnering with local governments around county-based or city-based strategies to revitalize those economies, again, feels like a very important priority that businesses should be engaging in. And then finally, I would say that it's not only the individual as the worker and the income line that we have to be mindful of, but also individuals as consumers. And we talked about the cost of living types of issues. We've seen examples in other parts of the world where through innovation and technology, when the cost, when the affordability and access to a range of services is dramatically increased, that just brings a whole new segment into the fold. That's good for business, but that's also very, very good for households who now actually have access to much lower cost healthcare, education, financial services. Access to digital and broadband is going to be critical. Affordable access at reasonable levels of speed should not be a privilege, that only the top half of the population can afford, when so much of future work and future income and future skill building actually depends on this as almost an essential service. So on the supply and access and creation of those products and markets, I think business can play a really important role there too.
And Tom, if I'm remembering the question you had asked about, maybe some examples of policies that have either created or continue inequality. Am I remembering?
So what are policies that can address it and reduce it? So similar to the issues you mentioned in Philadelphia with 400,000 residents in poverty, what are policies that can either reduce that or prevent it?
Sure, a couple of things. So again, a couple of examples. So our daughter, Olivia Nutter, is a Columbia College graduate, class of 17. She went to public school in Philadelphia, all 12 grades. One of the issues around inequality, certainly in the area of education, is how we pay for public education in many systems across the United States of America. And that is primarily through the property tax. And so in Philadelphia, where we live, on the western side of the city, but of course in the city, on average, the school district of Philadelphia spends about 14, 15, 16, depending on who's doing the calculation, $1,000 per student for education. If we had moved when Olivia was of school age, which I was never going to move, but if we had, 3 blocks from where I live today, she would have gone to school in the Lower Merion School District, which is in Montgomery County. They spend $27,000 to $30,000 a year to educate a child.
Yeah.
3 blocks from our house, we're all Pennsylvanians. Their taxes are about triple. If I move my house over there, it'd be about triple, but that's what people are paying for. And again, if you have the means, what often was happening is people unhappy with schools here in Philadelphia have means, move out of the city to the suburbs, their tax bill goes up, but more is also being spent on the education of their children. And so people will spend money, people will vote with their feet, they will do what they need to do in order to help give their children that boost. Again, I'm going to rely on my more trained economist friends, but I think, is it this generation, or I can't, after the millennials, I couldn't keep track of who was in what generation, but somewhere in this neighborhood, there is some cohort of young people who will not, for the first time in anybody's recorded history, do better than their parents. That is, in my view, I mean, that's a national disgrace for us. And I know there've been a lot of challenges, and we want to throw everything in the COVID bucket or the Great Recession of 2008 bucket, or some other excuse. There's virtually no problem, as again Professor Stiglitz pointed out. Suddenly, in a year, we've now figured out, oh, child poverty. Let's try to solve that. Okay, let's try to solve, I don't know, health disparities. Let's try to solve crime disparities. Let's try to deal with education. There are a wide variety of things. Why are there children in the United States of America, some of whom will not have enough food tonight, or their parents won't have enough food because they wanted their child to eat? And so, the great measurement, of course, of how the economy is doing for some is, look at the stock market. The stock market is up. America's on a roll. We're doing this, we're doing that. Stock market? There are people in this country who, A, don't have any stocks, but the market they're worried about is there a food market, a supermarket in their neighborhood? Why do we still have neighborhoods that are food deserts, right? And so, there's virtually no problem in the United States of America that cannot be solved by not only American ingenuity, but good old American dollars, right? So this is about politics, and the debates even that we've just seen right? So what is it, the American Society of Engineers, somewhere close in the neighborhood of those folks, right? C-, D+ on the infrastructure of America. Yet we have to have a political battle about how much money we're going to spend. And look, the bill that passed, I mean, it's still like a whole lot of money, right? But why are we having a debate about bridges and roads and tunnels and water systems and airports and hospitals? Do you know how many people would be able to go to work? I mean, new jobs on the construction side, and many of us spend a little less time, commuting. And so, I mean, there are benefits all the way around. It was the politics of it, and who's going to get what, and whose neighborhood is going to be better, and are there going to be more bridges fixed in Democratic areas than Republican? You know, no one at a toll booth has ever asked me my party. I do my easy pass, and then I go through and I paid for what I'm supposed to pay for. So, this is all, a lot of this is about politics, and it's all about the winning and losing and who's up and who's down. And a ton of folks have literally just kind of forgotten why they went into public service in the first place. It's not a game, it's serious business, and we shouldn't play with people's lives.
Thank you, Mayor Nutter. It's actually, Professor Stiglitz, we were just discussing this very issue a couple of days ago of how the local property tax impacts education and creates these disparities. And yet it's difficult to think of a system where we can actually address that. In my state, in Connecticut, we have a long-standing resolution from the state Supreme Court that it is unconstitutional by our state education funding. But Mayor Nutter, I absolutely echo your comments that the earlier you start, the earlier you entrench this.
Sure. I mean, I support the military, but I mean, and all the different missions. I mean, I'm not going to get into all those details, but I mean, obviously, America has to be strong on the defense of our country and our allies. But I mean, the Defense Department is not depending on a property tax to buy missiles. Education should be considered part of the national defense of the United States of America, and then funded properly. We're going to win on smarts. We're going to win on technology. We're going to win on information, not just that, we have, more missiles than anybody else.
Can I just echo one thing that the mayor pointed out, that COVID-19 has made so clear. We've never been as devastated by anything as COVID-19. And the fact that we have an inadequate healthcare system, it demonstrates our vulnerability. So, if we spent just a little bit more money on healthcare, we would have saved, it would have been the best national defense effort. And if you think what was most important national defense spending, it was development of the basic research that led to the mRNA vaccine. And so I've often said we've been focusing on weapons that don't work against enemies that don't exist, rather than working to try to create the kind of strong economy and society that can withstand whatever threats we have.
I like that, Professor Joe. Weapons that don't work against enemies that don't exist. I hadn't heard that one before. That's.
So I'm going to open it up for questions. I have a first one. As we know, this is an event sponsored by Columbia Business School. We have a lot of business school and other Columbia students in the audience. So the first question is about student loan debt. That's part of it. I think in general, what is the role of higher education? I know we talked about K-12 education, but what is the role of higher education in inequality what are thoughts about measures to forgive student loan debt? And just see. Yeah. What are, I think, Anu, you also mentioned some of the rising costs, and education is, I actually think it's the most, at least in the United States, it's actually higher than both housing and healthcare. So would be very curious to hear from anyone who would like to volunteer. What is the role that higher ed plays in inequality, and how can that possibly be improved?
Well, let me begin then. I think there are a couple of aspects of this. One of them is finance, another one is emissions. And there's been some very interesting discussion very recently on the role of our higher education system through a so-called system of meritocracy, of preserving inequalities and what I called before the intergenerational transmission of advantage and disadvantage. And I was very proud of my alma mater, Amherst College, which has just recently decided to eliminate legacy admissions because they saw it as part of the system of perpetuation of these inequalities. And it's not, one of the things that came out very clearly in some of the data that was exposed in the court case at Harvard was it's not just the direct legacy. A lot of the sports admissions, if you look at the sports admissions, they go for things like lacrosse, golf, and those are upper middle class sports. And so it turns out that what looked like, you just want to, we're just admitting athletes, people of different skills, actually is one of the ways in which racial inequalities and economic inequalities are perpetuated. But so there's a whole set of issues related to meritocracy and admissions. The other one is finance. And we ought to begin with the question of our system is broken. And when we were a much poorer country at the end of World War II, we said that everybody who had fought in the war, which was essentially every male and a lot of women, should get as much education as they were qualified for as long as they wanted to go. And it was transformative for the country, the GI Bill. Well, my view is that if we could have afforded it then, we could afford one way or another doing exactly the same thing for everybody in the country. And particularly for those groups that have been historically deprived, African Americans, Indigenous Americans, but for everybody. And the fact that we're having this political debate, the mayor referred to the political debate about robes. The same question is, why are we having a political debate about whether we can give 2 years of education in community colleges? Right. Why, the issue should be, we should be having a GI Bill for our country. If we want to have a strong country, that's the kind of framework that we need. Now, the student debt is trying to rectify a flawed system that we've had in the past. And we have to deal with that issue like we have to deal with a lot of historical legacies of injustices. And so, I put it in that broader bundle of dealing with past mistakes. but I'd like to focus more on going forward. I know a lot of people with a lot of student debt are focusing on their immediate issue, and I totally understand that. But I think the first order priority is getting a system that works well going forward.
I would also say that, I mean, it's an interesting, somewhat ironic question that we're discussing in the context of a university-sponsored meeting, but it is interesting as you think about, at least when we have analyzed the profile and pattern of lifetime earnings across a whole range of, different kinds of occupations, it's pretty clear that roughly half of lifetime earnings, give or take, really depend on learning that's enabled through the process of work experience, through the process of actually working in the context of organizations. It's that learning and experience that's actually such a big part of one's lifetime earnings. And it's also interesting that there are degrees and degrees and degrees, and there are some which, through a whole mix of factors, are very successful, well-honed engines of signaling market worth. And if you get one of those kinds of degrees, I mean, that's a function of specialization, but also brand recognition and scarcity value and all those things. So if you get one of those degrees, it signals a lot, and your entry level earnings are obviously very high. But if you don't, then the importance of the lifetime learning, right, that's enabled by your work experience is even higher for a person who comes in with an education degree that's not so differentiated and is not signaling to the market that there's much worth there. So as you think about this, I think there are two questions, right? How would you really allocate your dollars of support in terms of what kinds of learning should it enable, how much, or how should you think about structuring this over lifetime versus in the initial years, which for most people end at about in their mid-20s, but what happens after that? So that's sort of one important question to think through as you think about how to support education. It's not really a process that ends when you're in your mid-20s is I think the bottom line. And then the other question is, are our educational institutions really fit for purpose, and can they play a bigger role in this lifelong learning enablement that's so critical in the world going forward?
A couple of things I would mention. I mean, I have to admit that and I'm proud that she was our daughter was admitted to Columbia. But if someone had told me when Lisa and I were younger, or when Olivia was much younger, that we were going to end up spending $250,000 on an education, I would have said, well, I don't think that's really happening, because I'm in public service. I don't have that kind of money. But I mean, we were both working, and somehow, some way, we figured it out. But I mean, the debt load that many young people and not so young folks are carrying is crushing them. Even after graduate, you get the job, and I know there's sometimes been discussions about and there are some formulas and percent of income and a bunch of different things, but I mean it's kind of like that old Rent-A-Center idea. I mean you pay $5 a week for the rest of your life for a couch. I mean like, when have you actually paid for this thing? I mean you moved 3 times, the couch doesn't work anymore. It's lumpy, the springs are broken, you're still paying for it. So I think on the education side, we do need a different kind of model. At the same time, I mean full obvious, stating the obvious. I mean, I'm a professor at Columbia University, and tuition and a whole bunch of other things pay our respective salaries, but it's just we are leaving again these generations of folks who, many of whom, whether at the business school or at SEPA, I mean, not everyone is going to work on Wall Street or develop the latest, app and then get bought 3 times and all of that. So, I mean, some people are like just in some jobs, and they make, what they make, and, life might be, okay. But again, the level of debt, the whole community college thing is just insane. I think one of the greatest tragedies in American education and just the whole, the world of work was allowing what was, when I was a much younger person, was called SHOP. Excuse me, and then it was called vocational education, and I guess technically now that it's career and technical education, I could be a term or two behind, but the bottom line is people working with their hands, making things, building things, and obviously we still build some stuff, but nowhere near, right? I mean, Philadelphia was called the workshop to the world. We built, Baldwin locomotives, Stetson hats, and everything in between. Cars today are, basically computer systems with wheels. So, if my car breaks down, with every respect, I mean, I don't need a PhD. They're not going to help me very much. What I need is a certified mechanic who can fix this machine. And so that was, some decisions were made, and I think many of which are wrong. Now we're trying to build back. It's not a pun on what on President Biden's thing. I mean, we're literally trying to build back these systems of people making things and using their hands and using their brains and using technology, and it's just, again, there are so many things in front of us. They're plain to see, and many solutions are right there. And it's willpower, it's perseverance, it's guts. Do the right thing is more than just a movie title. I mean, there are just so many ways that we could make American society better, and we often just get in our own way.
Thank you, Mayor Nutter. Very, very inspiring conversation. I know I could go on like this for a while, but we are running up on time.
No.
So one last.
I was just getting started. I mean, I'm just getting kind of revved up here.
I hear you. There's gonna have to be a part 2 and a part 3. Yeah. So what I'm thinking is to close things off. Given that we have a lot of business school students, but also students from other graduate programs and other students as well. Just maybe a quick word of advice. How can students bring some of these lessons of become inclusive leaders, combating systemic inequity in less than a minute for each person, if that's possible? Any parting words of advice? Anu, do you want to go first?
I think it's important, regardless of what role you do as you go into the world, it's going to be critical for you to think about the impact you are having on a holistic basis. You can't be narrow about defining your success in terms of your bottom line or your immediate business objective. You just have to think more holistically about what that means for people around you, for workers, for your communities. And if everyone does that, I think it's just embracing that mindset that can help make change happen.
Thank you, Anu.
Joe, you want to go?
Professor?
Yeah. I agree with Anu, and let me add just 2 amplifications. One is the political community, the business community is very influential in politics. And when I go to meetings and business leaders say inequality is terrible, and then you ask them what's the solution, and they say is to lower the corporate income tax and lower the tax rate on rich individuals. There's a disconnect. So the political action that business leaders play such an important role in really has to be connected with a broader vision of society going beyond their pocketbook. The second thing is just share an experience I had at a dinner at Davos, where dinner I go to very often, and one of the very well-intentioned person at the last time I was there said he had just discovered that a third of his labor force was not getting paid a livable wage. And he had been talking about wages being low and all that. And it was just a moment when he started thinking, well, what's going on in my own company? And I guess what I want to urge when people go out into the business community, think local as well as global. Think about what your own company is doing in the way they treat all the stakeholders, your workers, your customers, the community in which you operate, and how what you are doing is affecting in a very local way, but millions and millions of other companies doing exactly the same thing has a macroeconomic effect. Think about how you're affecting inequality.
And Tom, what I would say is to the students, and I get asked all the time, are you, with all the things going on, and I mean, I could, certainly talk about, 19 different problems and challenges that we have. They say, well, but, are you feeling optimistic about the future? And I immediately always answer yes. I'm a professor at Columbia University. I have, 25 to 30 students in a class. I talk to them all the time, and I hear and know and see the work that so many of you are doing. And obviously I don't spend any time over in the business school, but my sense is you all are probably of the same mindset. So, figure out your passion, whatever it is. 1, 2, pursue it with virtually reckless abandon. And 3, figure out how to not only do good, but do well. There's nothing wrong with it. This is the United States of America, right? And there are a lot of ways to quote unquote give back, get engaged, get involved. Public service obviously is one. I'm biased in that regard. It's not for everybody, but check it out, have that experience. And in that regard, certainly participate in democracy. It's not a sideline experience. Democracy is a participatory engagement, and it's not just voting twice a year. For your entire life, until some elected or appointed official signs your birth certificate, you have not yet been born. And until some elected or appointed official signs your death certificate, you are not dead. And for all of the time in between, someone somewhere, elected or appointed, is making decisions that will affect your life directly or indirectly. Get engaged.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I'm sure if we were in person, we'd have a large round of applause for all of our panelists. Thank you again, all of you, for joining. Thank you for our participants as well. And have a nice evening. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank you.
Been good. Thank you, Tom. Appreciate it.
Thank you.